The offense of the Lord. On one occasion, involving John the Baptist, the Lord said, "Blessed is he, whosoever shall find no occasion of stumbling in me." In Darby's version it reads, "Blessed is whosoever shall not be offended in me." What does this mean? It means that we do not like what the Lord does. And from our perspective, we have good reason for not liking it. In our own eyes, we ought to be offended. That is the offense of the Lord. What the Lord did or did not do caused John the Baptist to be offended. John was not offended by the Pharisees or the publicans, but by the Lord. And from his standpoint, he had reason to be offended. Why was he offended? He had hoped that Israel would be restored as a nation, that the kingdom would be reestablished in justice and righteousness. He had hoped the Lord would bring in a revival. The first Elijah had gone up to Mount Carmel and had wrought mightily. Israel was revived and Elijah's ministry vindicated. But the second Elijah, John the Baptist, was put into prison and was soon to be killed, and yet no national restoration was in sight. So John sent a message to the Lord because he was greatly offended. He thought, "If I am not to accomplish anything, then surely you, Lord, are to do so. You ought to do something." Couched in a sting of rebuke, John's message to Jesus was, "Art thou he that cometh, or look we for another?" He wanted something done by the Lord by which to demonstrate who he, John, was. From John's viewpoint, nothing had been done thus far by Jesus to show who he indeed was, and thus nothing done by which to vindicate his ministry, which had now by his imprisonment come to an end. To not be offended in me is not to be offended by what the Lord does or does not do. We feel the Lord does not do what we want, what we feel he ought to do, that he does not vindicate us. Are we pleased with the way of the Lord with us? This is not just a matter of knowing and doing God's will, but a matter of whether or not we like his ways. Often we can do God's will, even though we may do it weeping. Even so, we are offended by the way he does things. We are offended with his way, his road, his method, and so forth. And thus it would seem as if we have a legitimate reason to be displeased. This has nothing to do with our Lord's dealings with our flesh, our sacrifice, and so on. For such dealings are on a far lower plane. But I am here speaking of those who have been brought to a place where the whole heart is for God, such as was the case with John the Baptist. We have sought to know his will, we have sought nothing for ourselves. We only want glory for God alone, and yet, in many of God's ways with us, we are disappointed. For example, we have come to a great difficulty, and yet no way through is opened up. We are ill and expect him to heal us, and yet we are not healed. We are weak, and yet no strength is given. We are short of money, and yet no money comes. It seems as if God does not measure up to our expectations of him. When such happens again and again, this is what we call the offense of the Lord. Many people lack the qualifications to be offended by the Lord. On the contrary, their fall is because of the flesh and the world. When the Lord seems to disappoint them, it is they who have been wrong, and they know and ultimately acknowledge it. Not to be offended in the Lord is the highest and deepest form of discipline. Often we feel the Lord must come in because of his testimony, because his honor and his faithfulness are at stake, yet he does not come in. God led the children of Israel out of Egypt, and then they were pursued. They got to a place where they were shut in by the enemy from behind. Mountains were to the right and left, and the Red Sea was in front. But then God opened a way through the sea. So whenever we too get to the place where we are shut in, we always expect God to open a way through for us. Yet often he does not do so. The prison gates do not open. The money does not come. The situation is not dealt with. Nevertheless, just here lies the test. Those who love the ways of the Lord can look up and say, "You are not pleased for us to die in Egypt, but you are pleased for us to die near the Red Sea." Whether the Red Sea opens or not, we are content, we are glad. Madame Guyon once said, "I believe God more than His word." Even though God does not seem to keep His promise, we believe Him in spite of that. Now this is to not be offended in the Lord. When there has been an utter consecration, more than when we are saved, more than when we give ourselves to His service, when there is a mighty consecration and awesome devotion to Him, it is when we get to that place that then we expect God to do something for us. If we have such an utterness towards the Lord, then we have a great expectancy. If, of course, we have not got to that stage, we can explain away much of everything which happens to us on the ground of our own weakness, that it is because we were wrong or mistaken, etc. But if we get to that place of utterness with the Lord just now described, wherein we expect to see God's deliverance, and yet He does not come in, wherein we feel we have a right for God to do such and such and He does not do it, that is the offense of the Lord of which we have been speaking. Yet it is those who are not offended who are blessed. We need, therefore, to get to a point where we have a liking for His ways, where we can say, "If you, Lord, act according to your promise, good, but if not, it is also good." There will indeed come a day when all things shall be explained and we shall see that God was right. At the present moment, however, His ways are much higher than our ways, and so we at times cannot see and understand. But when we stand before the judgment seat, not only will it be the occasion at which we shall be judged, it will also be the occasion at which God, again, I reverently state it, will have to explain things to us. There will be many cases in which I thought I was right but I was wrong. Yet there will also be other cases about which God will say, "I was right, but you were right also."